But whereas the individual human figures are buried almost in the brightness of their garments, the room they're in seems marked by a crisscrossing of lines that no longer delineate figures, but rather produces something like a texture. It's this texture in Hogarth's engraving that I believe corresponds to the narrator's insistence on Trim's attitude. Both texture and attitude are figures of space, that is, functions of spatial relations rather than depictions of objects or persons, or properties of objects or persons. The line that delineates individual figures divides the border of the space they inhabit, thus opening those borders, or at least rendering them porous, something like Trim's open palm, perhaps. The texture of the walls, ceiling, and floor thus appears more like a network than like a smooth, lithe surface. And in view of its interstices, it's no wonder that the characters in Tristram Shandy are always struggling to take a stand, or that things are always falling and falling out. But there's a second point more enigmatic, to which I want at the very end now to call your attention. It's almost as enigmatic, perhaps, as that anamorphically distorted skull in the foreground of Holbein's Ambassadors that Lacan analyzes in his seminar on the 4 fundamental concepts of psychoanalysis. Here, however, the enigma is less apparent, for what we see is not at all a distorted skull, although Parson Yorick, who's the author of the sermon, is somehow implied and reminds us of that aspect as well. What we see is rather an upside-down fallen hat. In the scene that Hogarth is illustrating, that hat of the novel, that hat plays no role. It is not even mentioned. In the picture, it is plausible to think that it's fallen off Dr. Slop's head as the good doctor falls asleep and as his head falls forward. But the hat occupies a rather peculiar position. Again, it's not mentioned in the text of the novel because there is no hat in this scene. It's fallen just at the border of light and dark, between what can be seen and what cannot, between sleep, perhaps, and death. This roll of the hat, the result of a certain movement of falling having come to rest, turns out to anticipate a passage in the novel that had not yet been written at the time that Hogarth composed his engraving. Is to be found in Book 5. These books were published 2 books at a time at intervals of a few years. Hogarth wrote this after the first 2 books were published, and it appeared from the 2nd edition on throughout. And Book 5 was in the 3rd installment, so about 5 years later. Is to be found then in Book 5 of the novel, published a few years after Hogarth composed his engraving. It is again a scene of Trim declaiming, but this time the occasion is the sudden and unexpected death of Tristram's brother, Bobby. Now, Bobby never appears in the novel. We find out about him only through the news of his death. To this news, Trim, it seems, finds the most powerful response. It contrasts with the response of Bobby's father, Walter, who falls into long and erudite discourses on mortality and mourning. Trim, by contrast, responds with a gesture. And this is your last citation. "He was alive last Whitsuntide," said the coachman. "Whitsuntide, alas," cried Trim, extending his right arm and falling instantly into the same attitude in which he read the sermon. "What is Whitsuntide, Jonathan," for that was the coachman's name, "or Shrovetide, or any time or time past to this? Are we not here now?" continued the corporal, striking the end of his stick perpendicularly upon the floor so as to give an idea of health and stability. "And are we not," dropping his hat upon the ground, "gone in a moment?" 'Twas infinitely striking. Susanna, the chambermaid, burst into a flood of tears. Trim repeats his attitude here, but this time not in reading a sermon, but in responding to the sudden, unexpected loss of life. And he does it at literally the drop of a hat. This expression, the drop of a hat, hardly used anymore these days in English, it seems to me, once signified the sudden intrusion of an unexpected event. Here it's not pronounced in words by Trim, but rather enacted through a striking gesture, that of letting his hat drop, quote, plumb upon the ground. Did Hogarth's engraving inspire Sterne to assign this gesture to Trim? Did he raise Hogarth's hat from the dead, as it were, in order to allow it to fall again in his novel? Does the answer really make any difference? Perhaps what's really important is the ways in which the literary image, which we cannot really see, can interact with the graven image, which we can see, to produce something that can neither be simply seen nor simply invisible, something that must be read, a gesture that is both more and less than a simple image, if indeed images can ever be simply simple. Thank you. If anybody like to say anything, I'd be glad to discuss. Yeah.
But then immediately what it made me think of was watching the Ten Commandments in its original version. Hardly measured up to the text.
I mean, I guess it's a very good. And and there you have an image of inscription and so on. But in other words, for me, what I keep, and this may be professional deformation. The prohibition against graven images apply to images that are taken to be simply representational. As soon as an image is something like a text to be read and so on, then it doesn't seem to fall necessarily under the prohibition, which would be against a certain type of representational image. So you can represent, but if what's represented involves something other than what than the objects it seems to represent, then I think maybe that would be in one way legitimate, even in view of the biblical prohibition there. So that it's not so much a question of what we usually think of as an image as opposed to a non-image, but really the function of what I would call representation as opposed to signification there. And so that being said, what still remains a mystery to me, and that really is professional deformation, is the differences in the medium. I mean, they're obvious. I know that there are differences, and I'm trying to sort of think about them, but I'm not feeling very satisfied that having said that you read an image, and it's not very new to say that, but it's still interesting, there are obviously profound differences, and I was, trying to begin to think about that, but I'd be very happy to get feedback from any of you. I know most of you here have worked a great deal more intensely, I think, with visual media than I have, and so I'd be happy to get any feedback that you might have on that.